So welcome back. We talked last time about the simulacra that Baudrillard analyzes, and we saw here that in the face of the iconoclasm, pictures are forbidden because they seem to stand between God and humans. But later on, we have the I have forgotten how he called it, but the people, the iconolators, the iconolators, I don't know how you call that, the people who actually embrace the picture. Now, why is that important? All in all, it just shows the different stages where a simulation emerges from and how representation is successively killed. He really uses the words of death here, right? And so he thinks there is a certain succession of how these phases of the image occur. First, we have reflection of a profound reality. So the image really reflects what reality is. Then the image masks and denatures a profound reality. So that means that the image somehow distorts what is in the reality below, and it already gains kind of life on its own. The more it gains that life, the more it starts to mask the absence of profound reality. We claim, no, this is a true image of God. And at some point, it then will have no relation to any reality whatsoever anymore, while that is the phase where the image becomes its own simulacrum. And he says, okay, we have here different cases. We have first the good appearance, where we still represent what is holy, we show what is holy. Then we come to the distorting relationship, which he calls evil. And finally, we come to a reality that resembles more and more sorcery. And the more that progresses, the more we get into the stage of simulation. And he further remarks here that there are basically two stages. First, a stage where we dissimulate that there is a relationship to reality, right? The pictures somehow distort that kind of relationship. And actually, they try to, the transition from science that dissimulates something to science. So they try to dissimulate that they are actually distorting the reality. I believe that's the way. And then we actually get to science that dissimulate that there is nothing, right? They try to dissimulate that they actually stand for nothing, like maybe the metaverse, or maybe even better, like certain kinds of, how is it called? Not the bitcoins, but the artworks that is built on top, the NFTs, right? The non-fungible tokens. Yeah, so this is the fact when the real is no longer of any meaning, and we escalate that more and more. And we have here a resurrection of the figurative, where the object and substance just vanish. Nothing's there anymore. And we are then just in the realm of the simulacrum. This is how simulation appears in the phase that concerns us, a strategy of the real, of the neo-real, and the hyper-real, that everywhere is the double of a strategy of deterrence. Now, I don't know what he means by deterrence here. Probably it's related to what he calls the panic-stricken production of the real, and the referential parallel to and greater than the panic of material production. So I guess what he says is, at some point we just produce signs in order to represent reality. I mean, I guess the moment when the metaverse has to show that it's real, it cannot refer to reality, so it just has to refer to more things inside of its cosmos. And maybe that's the same thing for NFTs, right? So yeah, how does he proceed? To be honest, it's a bit difficult to read Baudrillard because it's sometimes a bit unclear what he wants to do. So now he surprisingly talks about Ramses, the Egypt pharaoh, and his rosy-colored resurrection. Now, what does he want to do next? That's a bit unclear to me, but I think it's crazily interesting. So he starts talking about ethnology, which probably is something like anthropology. And in 1971, they discovered, it seems, some native people living in the bushes of the Philippines. But as soon as they were seeing the indigenous people, they disintegrated, as he writes, immediately, like mummies in the open air. And he tries to take that as an example that science somehow destroys its object. Here in this specific case, he says that for ethnology to live, its objects must die. By dying, the object takes its revenge for being discovered. And with its death, defies the science that wants to grasp it. So it's a bit mystical to me here why that should be the case for all sciences. For ethnology, that seems to be true, but why should the object die when it's grasped? So he says, why should the object in general die for sciences when you grasp it? And he says then, doesn't all science live on this paradoxical slope? And I wonder whether that is true. He compares it to Orpheus, who cannot turn back to see Eurydice, and she always falls into Hades. But I wonder, why is here the comparison to Orpheus? Is it because Orpheus has to research without seeing its object? As soon as Orpheus sees its object, he dies? As soon as all indigenous people are discovered, ethnology dies? Must, in this sense, there be a preservation of the object that should be discovered? I'm not sure. What do you think here about? Maybe you write that in the comments. So now he describes something interesting that ethnologists said. Well, you know, we shouldn't discover these people in these forests. We should leave them by themselves. So he calls that the emergence of anti-ethnology. And he calls it a simulated sacrifice of its object. And he says that the logical evolution of a science is to distance itself increasingly from its object until it dispenses with it entirely. Its autonomy is only rendered even more fantastic. It attains its pure form. So science, in order to preserve the object, dispenses the object. It throws it away. But I mean, for ethnology, I understand, but do we have more examples from other sciences in that regard? I don't see how sciences do that in general. So that's one of my big questions here. I mean, he just writes great, right? He now compares that with a glass coffin. So the object is dead because they're preserved in this virgin forest of the Philippines. They are not allowed to be touched anymore. And so we have here a model of the simulation because the savages that exist in the forest are not really savages. As he says, there are savages who are indebted to ethnology for still being savages. So ethnology preserves the status of being savages. So they are not savages in themselves, they are savages for ethnology. I mean, maybe it is a bit of a comparison of how science produces its objects. So science, by trying to investigate its object, produces and simulates its object. I could understand it that way. But I'm still a bit unsure how ethnology here serves as an example for science in general. As an example for the simulation, I can understand it. Yeah, he says that with these examples, science itself becomes a pure simulation. Ethnology is not working as ethnology anymore to discover something, but to preserve And he says that there are different examples. For example, the open museum where witnesses of their period, entire working class neighborhoods living metallurgic zones and entire cultures, men, women, and so on, are preserved. An open museum, and that is kind of absurd, right? And ethnology wants to make itself invisible by preserving things, by putting them into glass coffins. It is omnipresent, but is it omnipresent? Are we preserved everywhere? And is this a real method of our time? I mean, I can see that he uses it as an example for the simulacrum, but I wonder how that is true. Yeah, so he says so that ethnology is now everywhere. This in the third word, in the metropolises, in the white community, in a word completely cataloged and analyzed. Then artificial resurrected under the auspices of the real in a world of simulation, of the hallucination of truth, of the blackmail of the real, of the murder of every symbolic form, and of its historical retrospection. Yeah, so somehow it is everywhere. I still try to understand how it is everywhere. Hallucination of the truth. I mean, if I look in a modern city and how they try to preserve classical music, like Beethoven or Mozart, and how they try to play them without changing them, they lose their original meaning, their meaning with regard to the real. So maybe he wants to say that somehow we have a tendency to produce a preservation of pictures which actually gets rid of the relationship to the real. And I guess that's the same when we drive a Ferrari, when we buy expensive bags or something, when we engage into this capitalist organization of our world that just produces, right? I just wonder whether that is also true for science. Does science lose its contact to the real? Maybe. I mean, most of it is a simulation of doing science, right? Like when you're a single scientist in a laboratory where you just repeat, or you write a PhD, you just look into some documents without any relationship to the real. I don't know. That's an interesting question. Maybe you let me know how you understand it in the comments. So this is called assisted reading. That doesn't mean that I know everything. We assist each other. We maybe discuss each other. If you can help me here with the interpretation, I would be very thankful to you. So in any case, thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. Live long, read more Baudrillard. Don't lose your connection to the real, and prosper.